Welcome to the sixth lecture in our series on Big Idea 1, Evolution. This is on the origin of species. And I just noticed I didn't put a G here. Yay! Let's make connections. Making connections. Anyway, we've got, of course, our Big Idea 1, which is the big idea we're on. Speciation may occur when two populations become isolated from one another. We're going to talk about speciation today. Big Idea 2, differences in timing and behavior. Big Idea 3, cellular signaling and transduction, transmission. And then Big Idea 4, relationships and the environment. So here we go. What is something that you can tell about this bird from just looking at it? Maybe you notice that its wings are a little bit lacking or seem to not maybe look like it would be able to make this bird fly. Well, that's actually true. This is a flightless cormorant, and this flightless bird lives on the Galapagos Islands. One of the questions that Darwin asked back in his day was, how in the world did a flightless bird come to live on an island? So we can hypothesize that it probably descended from a type of cormorant that could actually fly. And it came over from the mainland, and then through natural selection somehow and speciation, this became a bird that can no longer fly. Okay, so today we're going to talk about speciation, where we have one species that splits into two or more. It's going to help us form a bridge between the macro evolution, where organisms like mammals or flowering plants came about, where you see new groups of organisms, and microevolution, which are the small changes that we've been talking about, those changes in allele frequencies that lead to smaller changes within a species or within the population. Speciation can help us explain both why we have so many different organisms, but also why they all seem to be somehow related to each other. So we have a couple different ways to look at what is a species, and one of the biggest ways that we'll look is the biological species concept. We have to ask ourselves, is the word species just an arbitrary designation? Does it really mean anything? And when we take a look at all of these different definitions and see that there are a lot of them, although we're only going to focus on a couple, we can see that it just depends on who is doing the defining of the species and what it is that they're looking for. So when a scientist wants to compare morphology, physiology, biochemistry, and DNA, so what it looks like, how it works, the smaller how it works, the biochem behind it, and also the ATGC, what are the sequences, what are the genes, we can look at differences in those and see that we can have distinct species despite two things that may look similar. Okay, so here we have the here we have two different bird species that look very similar, but they do have different physiological responses, different song types, different mating rituals, different other breeding behaviors, and some small changes in DNA sequences, although they, again, look a lot alike. So when we look at the biological species concept, we're looking at populations that can interbreed. So an easy way to say this is we're looking at organisms that can mate, they can have babies that can have babies. So can they get together, can they make a baby, and can their baby make a baby? Or can their babies make babies? Okay. For instance, humans on different sides of the world can mate. It doesn't matter if you're a businesswoman in New York or a farmer somewhere in China. Two humans, if they were able to find each other, you know, maybe through Tinder or something, they could mate and have a baby that could most likely have another baby. However, on the other hand, chimpanzees, even though they are related to us and share a lot of the same DNA, even if we wanted to, which we really shouldn't want to, but even if a human wanted to, it would not be able to make a baby with a chimpanzee that would survive and be able to have more babies. So when we get no gene flow between organisms or groups of organisms, we get different species. There are some different barriers that create this, what we would call reproductive isolation, when two organisms cannot reproduce and form viable or fertile offspring. And we're going to talk about some of those more specifically. We'll zoom in on some pictures and discuss each one. You should probably write some of them down or just jot down some notes as you see them. But this reproductive isolation is actually going to limit hybrids. So maybe possibly in regular bio you heard hybrid and heterozygous used synonymously. They are not. So hybrid is when two different species combine to form an in-between, and heterozygous is just two different alleles. Usually the heterozygous condition, you're going to still see the dominant phenotype, okay? Unless, of course, we're talking incomplete or codominance, and we can discuss those later if you have questions. But in a hybrid, it really is a mixing of the two. This happens a lot in plants. But let's talk about some of those barriers that are going to keep this reproductive isolation happening. There are prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. Pre, of course, means before, and zygote is a fertilized egg. So these are barriers that will happen reproductively before the egg can even be fertilized. They can impede mating. They can prevent completion of mating. They're in the process of, but something just prevents it from happening. And they can also hinder fertilization. Post-zygotic, or after the zygote is formed, barriers can include infertility in the offspring or developmental errors that cause the organism to be mutated or maybe not able to survive in its environment. So let's take a closer look at some of these. We're going to go with the habitat isolation here. So pictures A and B show us habitat isolation. We have two different species. They can occupy different habitats and probably rarely encounter each other, which is going to limit gene flow between the two populations. It's like a physical barrier. So we're thinking like a mountain range or something that's going to keep these two snake species apart. So these are two gardener snakes that live in different areas. So they they're not able to breed anymore because they're geographically isolated from each other. Okay, then if we take a look at the next two sets, C and D, this is a temporal isolation. That's another kind of reproductive barrier that can happen. And this is when species will breed during different times of the day, during different seasons, or maybe even during different years. Okay, so if one species of the spotted skunk pictured here breeds in the late winter and the other species breeds in the late summer. So that way they're actually isolating themselves because their breeding times are completely different. We have the blue-footed boobies for our example of behavioral isolation. And the blue-footed boobies have this really interesting courtship ritual that helps them to attract mates. So the males have blue feet, and they do this high stepping kind of dance to show off their feet to the female. And if she likes his dance and likes the way his feet are colored, then she will mate with him. So this is a way of mate reproduction. So if a bird does not have a booby bird does not have these blue feet, the female is less likely to mate with him, so, or display that behavior. So I would show you a video, but I haven't figured out how to insert that yet. Okay, now let's go over to our little snails here. Now this is a mechanical isolation. I'm try to say this one with a straight face, quote unquote. Okay, so this is mechanical isolation, is when they really want to mate, but they have body differences that don't allow them to be able to mate, that prevent this successful completion. So here we have two species of snails. As you can see here, their shells spiral in different directions, which you might be like, why is that a problem? But because of this, their genital openings are on opposite sides, and therefore they can't do it with each other. They can't mate, so it doesn't work. That would be a mechanical form of isolation. And moving on. Okay, so then we have gametic isolation. Here we have some sea urchins. And in this case, gametic isolation is when the sperm and the egg just can't fuse together. So in the case of the sea urchins, the red sea urchin and the purple sea urchin have different proteins on the surfaces of their egg and sperm, and it does not allow those two to be able to bind together. Therefore, there's no fertilization event occurring and no new babies. Let's see, in reduced hybrid viability, it's a cute little salamander there. So the genes of the parents interact in different ways that could, impair the hybrid's ability to survive. So in this example of the salamander, they don't really complete development, and if they do, they're kind of weak and frail, and they don't usually survive to be able to reproduce later on. Okay, then we go to another form of post-zygotic barrier, which would be a reduced hybrid fertility. I think we've all encountered this before. We have the male donkey and female horse. And then they come together and they make a mule. Okay. Or if you have a female donkey and a male horse, then we get a hinny. But mules and hinnies cannot reproduce with other mules. They're effectively sterile. Okay. And then finally, our last type of post-zygotic, so these last three were, let me pull that out of there. Post-zygotic were the last three, and the others were pre-zygotic, so before the zygote form. So the last form is hybrid breakdown. And then this is where the first generation of the hybrids can produce offspring that are fertile, but then when they go to mate with each other or other parent species, they become less sterile and less sterile. So this can happen in an organism like rice, which is pictured here. They have different mutant alleles that over time the plants aren't able to reproduce with each other, and therefore they can't be considered different species because they are separated post-zygotically, so after the zygote is formed. That was a long one. I apologize. Hopefully the next ones won't be quite as long. So sometimes there are limitations to this idea of the biological species concept and this idea of reproductive isolation. So one thing is that we have no way to apply this to fossils. We can't see what was happening reproductively with fossils, so we don't know. Another thing that the biological species concept can't apply to organisms that asexually reproduce, because there's a lot of sharing of genes and they're making copies of themselves, so this doesn't really even apply. Sometimes, though, we can even have where you have many pairs of species that are unique, but gene flow still happens. So there are alternative species concepts that will come about. But I want to give you an example of where we can have a pair of species that are unique to each other, but we still get gene flow. Okay, and kind of like with the donkey, but and the horse making the mule, but not completely. Okay. So when you have a polar bear, and that polar bear falls in love with a grizzly bear, some mating may occur, and if mating does occur, so yeah, if mating does occur, we get this amazing looking animal called the hybrid roller bear. You may also know of ligers or tigons. So the only difference is that they believe that these may be able to reproduce. They are geographically isolated from each other normally, but on occasion they can come together and make a growler bear baby. Okay, so the biological species concept was looking at differences between organisms. The other options that we're going to discuss here are more based on unities or similarities between them. The morphological species concept is going to look at just body shape and structures, and what's good about it is it doesn't rely on gene flow. What's bad about it is it's very subjective. Who is doing the classification of these organisms into different species? That will determine what they feel are characteristics that are close enough to be clumped together as a species. Okay. In an ecological species concept, we're looking at the species niche. So for an example, two oak trees that can interbreed, but in each of their habitats have a differing ability to be able to tolerate dryness or lack of water, can now be considered separate species, even though by our biological species concept they would be considered the same. By the ecological species concept, they would be different. This is very phylogenetic. This is also very subjective. How much difference do we say would equal being an ecological species? And then the last one that we're going to look at is the phylogenetic. And again, this is, well, of course, it's phylogenetic. We're looking at comparisons, but we're also looking, again, at a subjective idea. You might say two differences make something two different species. Somebody else might say four differences make two organisms two different species. Okay, but in this, we're looking at what is the smallest group that's able to share that common ancestor. Thankfully, we're only going to focus mainly on that biological species concept, but we did need to at least talk about three of the other main ideas. There are over 20 more that we don't need to even worry about. Okay, so now there's two ways to go about this speciation, and we're going to talk about each one, and each one depends on how that gene flow between populations is interrupted. So we have allopatric speciation, which literally allopatric means other country. And this is where we have a population that is divided, like the river meanders off in a different direction and actually divides or separates two groups of organisms. Or the lake subsides and there's a formation in the lake that keeps one species from being able to reach the other. So like maybe two mini lakes or mini ponds form from that. Okay. There are some organisms that can overcome this. That's why it says it's dependent on organisms. Okay, birds, they can fly, so there's not very much that's going to keep them separated. A river, they can just fly over it, right? But mice, they're a little bit less able to be able to get around those geographical barriers. So in allopatric, speciation, it's basically 3 steps. We have to have some sort of geographic isolation occur. And then the separated gene pools of those two that were just geographically isolated diverge through natural selection. Okay. More mutations, natural selection is going to happen, and those are going to alter the gene and allele frequencies in each of the populations, eventually causing a new species to be formed. This is not to say that there aren't biological barriers that still exist. So we did talk about all of those, like the morphological barriers when things just don't match up correctly, or the gametic barriers when the gametes can't fuse together. Okay. An example of this that we can look at today are the mosquito fish. Mosquito fish live in an area where they were geographically separated, and now there's 2 populations. One species of mosquito fish lives in an area where there are lots of predators. This mosquito fish has a body that's more streamlined and designed for short bursts of energy to escape the predators. The other species of mosquito fish lives in an area where there aren't predators. So their bodies are a different shape, and they're built more for sustaining long periods of swimming. Here's another example of that allopatric speciation. So there are 30 species of things called snapping shrimp. You can see they have those little pinchers on them. Okay. So 15 of those species live on the Atlantic side, and 15 of the species live on the Pacific side. Well, what genetic data has told us is that there are sister species. So basically there are 15 species groups that are sisters. So if there's a group that lives on the Atlantic side, there's a matching group or sister group that lives on the other side. Now, they're not the same species, but they're very, very closely related. So what this tells us is that geographic isolation happened when the land bridge was formed here between North and South America, pushing these 15 different species apart from each other. And then that's why we have very similar relatedness between the sister species. Okay, the next type of speciation is sympatric speciation. This is where they're going to live in the same area, but we're still going to have a reduction in gene flow between species that's going to cause some sort of differentiation and cause new species to form. So an example of this could be polyploidy, where the organism gets an extra set of chromosomes. This is really common in plants. A lot of plants like to self-pollinate, and therefore they can end up with 2 sets of chromosomes from the same organism, 2 or more sets. Okay, so then instead of having 2N, now all of a sudden their number is 4N. They cannot reproduce with the parent anymore, so then they become a separate species. We can also have hybrid production, which is allopolyploidy. This is where we get two species that will breed together, and they'll produce an infertile offspring, but that infertile offspring can reproduce with itself. Plants, again, like to do that. And over time, they become fertile because they become separated enough through multiple reproductions with itself and mutations that can occur that it will become a totally different species. So this is the American apple maggot fly, which used to, in its parent population, feed off of the hawthorn trees. Well, some genetic factor caused these organisms that kind of look like a fly mated with a zebra to be able to be ready, mature early enough, and they would eat the apples or feed on the apples. Well, because they were doing that, they became isolated from the parent population that were still feeding on the later blooming or longer to develop hawthorn tree fruits. So they haven't quite become a totally different species yet, but we can actually see this happening, that it will eventually become a new species. But right now we're just calling it a subpopulation. Then we have sexual selection, like the cichlids in Africa's Lake Victoria. At one point in time, there were over 600 species of cichlids. One hypothesis is that they were adapted to different food sources, but most likely it was sexual selection. There were some females that preferred the blue coloring of the one type of cichlid, and some females that preferred the red coloring of another type of cichlid. So then they began to reproductively isolate each other through mate selection. So what happens if we have an incomplete reproductive barrier, where it's kind of there but not completely, and there still can be some mixing? Well, that's called a hybrid zone. Hybrid zones are where we have that incomplete barrier, and the different species can meet, and usually they end up mating, and then they form that hybrid. And remember, hybrid doesn't necessarily mean heterozygote. It is the cross between two parent species, two different parent species that make a new organism. Okay, so an example that we have here, so you can zoom in on this, is the yellow-bellied toad and the fire-bellied toad. If we take a look at their range up here in the left corner, top left corner, the yellow-bellied toad frequency in its area is about 90% at the edge. In the center, where the hybrid zone would be, the yellow-bellied frequency is 50%, and then of that allele, sorry. And then in the fire-bellied zone, the yellow frequency is only about 10%. So we can see in that hybrid zone, we have a mixing, but in the two parent zones, they are completely separate from each other. There can be three outcomes of hybrid zones, and those are reinforcement of barriers, fusion of species, and stability. Let's take a look at this picture a little bit more, peek in on that. Okay, so we have our original population, and then something happens, and we get a lack of gene flow. Then we've got two different species. I don't know what these are. They look like clouds. So we got blue clouds and pink clouds. I'm not really sure. Okay, but whatever we want those organisms to be. Well, in here is that hybrid zone where the hybrids are being formed. This parent comes together with this parent and makes a hybrid. So the three possible outcomes, we can have reinforcement, where the barriers are strengthened and actually the hybrids will cease to be formed eventually. Okay. We can have the fusion of a hybrid zone where there's a weakening of the reproductive barrier, and then the two species will fuse together and form one. So an example of this would be cichlids that live in murky or clouded water. The females, which normally like to choose males based on color and how they look, can't really see the males. So then there's no sexual selection by color preference, and hybrids are produced, and then those two parent gene pools will become fused. And then the final hybrid zone possibility is just stability, where hybrids will continue to be made. Most of the time they have some sort of survival advantage, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the hybrids are made and they get picked off, which allows the parent generations to be able to survive and stick around longer and become stronger. So speciation can happen over time. Our fossil record, when we look back in our history, shows that there seem to be many times where we have new emergence of species. New species that weren't there previously in older rock layers are all of a sudden there. So this could either happen in two ways. Either a gradual change over time, which may take a gene, a few genes, many gene changes. It all depends. Really, what we're actually saying is there is no true answer for this, okay? Or it could be what we know as punctuated equilibrium. This is where there is stasis of species that's punctuated or hit, basically, with a rapid change. So I'm going to show you a picture of that on the next slide. Okay, so here we have the two different models. So in model B down here, we have a gradual change. You see that there's just a slight change between these two species, and then over time they keep changing just a little bit at a time until at the end we've got two totally different species. Or we have situation A, which is the punctuated model. Something happened that caused an immediate change in the two organisms, and then those stay steady or at stasis over time. Okay, so there are times where we know that we have a punctuated situation happening where we've observed it, and there are times where we know that it had to be a more gradual change between the two organisms. So sometimes this is hard to see in the fossil record because we can't always tell, this change might have happened over just a few thousand years, and sometimes we can't delineate the layers in the rock to that close of a time. We can't say, oh my gosh, this is 1,000 years and this is 3,000 years. So we can only know within maybe 500,000 years what we're seeing. Okay. And then sometimes we can't always, I don't even know what I was going to say. We'll just stop there. So this is just an example of a hybrid sunflower species that we were able to test in the lab and see how rapid speciation could occur. So they took the two parent type of sunflowers, made the hybrid, and then were able to see that in a very short amount of time, we had a lot of genetic differences built up and created a new species. Okay, we've seen this in the cichlids, and we've also seen it in fruit flies, where over a very short amount of time, nature can create new and unique species. But again, remember, it can also take a lot of time. So in summary, what we were really looking at is there are many ways for new species to form. And really, it's based on gene flow. What genes are coming in, what genes are leaving. is there a barrier to gene flow? And what are those barriers? Okay, because the more the barriers, the more quickly we think that species will be able to form. And remember that small changes, which are microevolution, those allele frequencies and things that we have been studying, can accumulate and lead to large-scale species formations, so speciation, which we're going to call macroevolution. So if you're thinking molecules to man, that's macroevolution, one species forming another. Microevolution is small changes within the species, like the moth population, when we had more white moths than dark moths, and then more dark moths than white moths, and then now we're back to more light than dark. So please ask if you have any questions, and I hope that this was a good summary of the things that you've been working on in class on speciation and how speciation occurs. Thanks.